What if I told you that the most important thing that kept me alive to 100 was never written on a prescription, never explained in a clinic, and never once emphasized by any doctor I ever met? I am 100 years old now, and I will say this plainly. I did not get here by following every rule perfectly. I listened, yes. I respected medical advice. But the truth that carried me through a century of living came from somewhere else, somewhere quieter, something I had to notice for myself. For most of my life, I believed health was something managed from the outside. You go to a doctor, you get instructions, you follow them carefully. Eat this, avoid that, take this pill, monitor that number. It felt structured, safe, and logical. And yet, over the years, I began to notice something unsettling. People who did everything right still broke down, and others, less strict, less controlled, somehow remained steady, even strong, far longer than expected. That contradiction stayed with me. It didn't make sense, at least not in the way I had been taught to think. Doctors are trained to identify problems. They measure, diagnose, and intervene, and they do that remarkably well. But no one ever sat me down and said, "Here is how you stay whole." Not just how you avoid disease, but how you live in a way that doesn't slowly wear you down. That I had to learn on my own. And I didn't learn it quickly. I learned it through years of tension, through nights when my body was tired but my mind would not rest, through moments when I realized I was doing everything correctly and still feeling unwell inside. Then, slowly, something became clear. The body does not only respond to what you eat or what you take, it responds to how you live, your pace, your thoughts, the pressure you carry, the way you hold on to things long after they should have been released. Doctors checked my blood pressure, but no one asked how much pressure I was placing on myself. They listened to my heart, but no one asked what was weighing on it. And over time, I began to see a pattern I could no longer ignore. The people who aged the hardest were not always the sickest. They were the most tense, the most burdened, the ones who never learned how to let life move, without trying to control every part of it. So many years ago, I made a quiet decision. I stopped living as if everything depended on force. And that single shift, simple, almost invisible, became the one thing no doctor ever told me, yet the one thing that changed everything. I did not arrive at that realization because I was wise. I arrived at it because I was tired, deeply, quietly tired, in a way that sleep could not fix. There was a period in my life, around my late 40s, when I was doing everything I believed was correct. I followed medical advice closely. I paid attention to what I ate. I stayed active. I went to my checkups. If a doctor told me to change something, I changed it. I believed, with full sincerity, that discipline alone could secure my health. But inside, something was not right. I was constantly tense, not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly, persistently. My mind was always moving, planning, worrying, replaying conversations, anticipating problems that had not yet happened. I carried responsibilities like they were fragile glass, afraid that if I loosened my grip, everything would shatter. On paper, I was healthy, but in my body, I felt tight. And that is a difference most people do not recognize until it is too late. There is a kind of life where everything looks fine, but nothing feels at ease. I would sit in front of doctors and hear the same reassuring words. Your results look good. And I would smile, nod, and thank them. But when I stepped outside, nothing inside me had changed. My chest still felt heavy. My thoughts still raced. My body still felt like it was bracing for something that never arrived. It created a quiet confusion in me. If everything is fine, why do I not feel fine? That question stayed with me longer than any diagnosis ever did. So I began to observe more carefully, not just myself, but the people around me. Not what they said, but how they lived. Not what they claimed, but what their bodies revealed over time. There was a woman who lived a few houses away from me. She was older, perhaps in her 60s then. She moved slowly, never rushed. She did not follow strict routines. She ate simply, sometimes unpredictably. By all modern standards, she was not optimized. And yet there was something about her that I could not ignore. She was at ease, not lazy, not careless, just unburdened. When she walked, her body did not resist itself. When she spoke, there was no urgency behind her words. When she sat, she actually rested, not just physically, but completely. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself she was just fortunate or perhaps unaware. But as the years passed, I began to notice something undeniable. She remained steady, while others, people who followed strict diets, rigid schedules, and constant self-monitoring, began to show signs of wear. Not always illness, but fatigue, irritability, a kind of quiet depletion that no supplement seemed to fix. That contrast forced me to look at something I had been avoiding. Maybe health is not only about what we do, but how we do it. Maybe the body is not just reacting to actions, but to the internal state behind those actions. I began to notice my own patterns more clearly. I did not just eat carefully, I ate with tension. I did not just plan my days, I tried to control them. I did not just care for my family, I carried them emotionally, as if everything depended on me holding it all together. Even when I was resting, I was not at rest. And slowly, I understood something that no doctor had ever explained to me. The body keeps a record of pressure, not just physical pressure, but emotional, mental, invisible pressure that accumulates quietly over years. And unlike a sudden illness, this kind of pressure does not announce itself loudly. It wears you down gradually, almost politely, until one day you realize you are no longer living, you are enduring. Doctors measure numbers, blood pressure, heart rate, glucose levels, and those measurements matter. But there is another kind of pressure, one that cannot be captured in a test, that influences everything those numbers eventually become. And no one taught me how to release it. So I started experimenting in the smallest ways. Not with my diet at first, not with exercise, but with how I moved through my own life. I began by noticing when I was rushing unnecessarily, when I was holding tension in my shoulders for no reason, when I was thinking about things that did not require immediate attention. And instead of forcing myself to be different, I simply softened. That was the beginning. I did not change everything overnight. I did not become a different person, but I made one subtle shift. I stopped treating every moment like it required control. If something could wait, I let it wait. If something could unfold on its own, I allowed it. If a thought did not serve me, I did not chase it. At first it felt uncomfortable, almost irresponsible. I had spent so many years believing that control was necessary, that if I did not stay vigilant, something would go wrong. Letting go, even slightly, felt like stepping into uncertainty. But something unexpected happened. My body responded, not dramatically, not instantly, but noticeably. My breathing became deeper without effort. My shoulders relaxed without me reminding them to. My sleep, which had been restless for years, began to settle. Nothing external had changed, but internally something had shifted. And that is when I understood the one thing more clearly. It was not a food. It was not an exercise. It was not a supplement or a secret technique. It was the absence of constant internal pressure. That was the thing no doctor ever told me, because it is difficult to measure, difficult to prescribe, difficult to standardize, but it is real, more real than most people realize. Over time, I began to see how deeply this affected everything else. When you live with constant pressure, even good habits become heavy. Eating well feels like a rule. Exercise feels like an obligation. Rest feels like something you have to earn. And the body quietly resists. But when that pressure is reduced, when you stop forcing every outcome, those same habits become lighter, more natural, more sustainable. I did not abandon discipline. I did not ignore my health, but I stopped approaching it with tension, and that made all the difference. I also began to notice something else, something even more subtle. The people who lived the longest and lived well were not necessarily the most disciplined. They were the most adaptable. They did not cling tightly to one way of doing things. They adjusted. They allowed life to change without resisting it at every turn. They did not carry every disappointment forever. They did not rehearse every fear repeatedly. They moved with life instead of against it. And their bodies reflected that. Less strain, less rigidity, more resilience. I realized then that longevity is not just about avoiding harm. It is about reducing friction, internal friction that slowly wears the system down. And that friction often comes from how tightly we hold on to control, to expectations, to past experiences that should have been released long ago. No doctor ever told me that holding on too tightly could aid you, but I have seen it again and again over a lifetime, and I have lived the difference myself. By the time I reached my 60s, the shift I had made in my 40s had already begun to show its effects. I felt lighter, not younger, not stronger in a dramatic sense, but more stable, more at ease in my own body. And that stability carried me forward, decade after decade, not perfectly, not without challenges, but without the constant weight I used to carry. If I could say it simply, this is what I learned. The body thrives not only on what you give it, but on what you stop forcing it to endure. And once I understood that, I never went back to the old way of living. By the time I reached my 70s, I began to understand something even more quietly profound. Letting go of pressure was not just a habit, it was a way of seeing life. Up until then, I thought I had made a useful adjustment. I believed I had simply reduced stress, improved my routines, and become a calmer version of myself. But what I hadn't yet realized was that this one thing, this absence of constant internal pressure, was shaping every decision I made, every reaction I had, and every relationship I carried. It was no longer something I practiced. It had become something I lived. And that is where the real difference began. Because life does not become easier as you age. If anything, it becomes more unpredictable. People you love change. Some leave. Some fade. Your body changes in ways you cannot fully control. There are losses you cannot prevent and moments you cannot prepare for. In those years, I watched many people struggle, not because they lacked knowledge, but because they resisted what they could not control. They fought reality. They replayed what should have been different. They carried regret like it was something that could still be fixed. And their bodies carried that fight with them. You could see it in their posture, in their breathing, in the way they spoke, always slightly tense, always slightly holding something back or holding something in. That kind of living creates a constant internal resistance, and resistance over time becomes exhaustion. I began to see that clearly, and I made another quiet decision, not all at once, not perfectly, but consistently. I stopped arguing with what had already happened. This was not about giving up. It was not about becoming passive or indifferent. It was about recognizing a simple truth. The past does not respond to pressure. No amount of mental force can change what is already done. But many people live as if it can. They revisit old conversations, old mistakes, old pain, and each time their body reacts as if it is happening again. The heart tightens, the breath shortens, the muscles contract, and over years that repeated pattern becomes a baseline state. Doctors do not measure how often you relive your past, but your body keeps count. I learned to interrupt that pattern. Whenever I noticed myself holding on to something that had already passed, I asked a simple question. Is this helping my body right now? And the answer was always the same. No. So I practiced releasing, not dramatically, not emotionally, but quietly. Sometimes it meant letting a thought pass without following it. Sometimes it meant accepting that I would never get a certain answer or closure. Sometimes it meant allowing myself to feel something fully and then not carrying it into the next day. That last part changed me more than anything else. I stopped carrying yesterday into today. And over time, my body became lighter, not because life was easier, but because I was no longer adding unnecessary weight to it. There is something else doctors never told me. Your body does not only age from time, it ages from accumulation, accumulated tension, accumulated stress, accumulated unresolved emotion, accumulated resistance, and most of that accumulation is optional, though it does not feel that way when you are inside it. When I began to release that accumulation, slowly, consistently, something remarkable happened. My energy stabilized, not in a youthful, energetic way, but in a steady, reliable way. I no longer had sharp peaks of energy followed by deep exhaustion. I became more even, more sustainable. And that, I came to understand, is far more valuable than short bursts of vitality. Because a long life is not built on intensity, it is built on continuity. You do not reach 100 by pushing harder than everyone else. You reach it by not wearing yourself down unnecessarily. That is the difference. I also began to notice how this affected my relationships. In my earlier years, I carried people in a heavy way. I worried about them, tried to fix things for them, held on to their problems as if they were mine to solve. It came from love, but it also came from a belief that I had to control outcomes to keep things stable. But that belief created pressure, not only in me, but in the people around me. Because when you carry others too tightly, you do not give them space to live, and you do not give yourself space to breathe. So I changed that too. I remained present. I remained caring, but I stopped carrying what was not mine to carry. If someone I loved was struggling, I listened, I supported, but I did not absorb their struggle into my body. That boundary, gentle but firm, protected something I had only begun to understand. Your internal state is your responsibility, and if you do not protect it, no one else will. Doctors cannot do that for you. Medication cannot do that for you. Only awareness and the willingness to release what is not necessary can do that. By the time I reached my 80s, this way of living had become natural. I no longer had to remind myself constantly. I did not analyze every thought. I did not monitor every reaction. The tension that once felt normal had become unfamiliar, and in its place there was something else. Space. Space in my mind, space in my body, space between events and reactions. And in that space I found something I had never experienced in my younger years. Ease. Not the absence of problems, but the absence of unnecessary struggle. That is a distinction most people miss. Life will always bring challenges. That does not change. But the internal resistance we add to those challenges, that is where most of the damage happens. And that damage accumulates slowly, quietly, until it becomes visible in the body. I have lived long enough to see this pattern clearly. The people who hold on tightly, to control, to worry, to pass pain, tend to age faster, even if they do everything else correctly. And the ones who learn to release, to adapt, to move with life instead of against it, they last longer. Not just in years, but in quality of life. They remain present. They remain steady. They remain alive in a way that goes beyond survival. This is why I say with complete certainty that the one thing doctors never told me was not a technique, not a rule, not a formula. It was a principle. Stop forcing life, not in your actions, but in your internal state. Because the body does not only respond to what you do, it responds to how much resistance you carry while doing it. And when that resistance is reduced, when you stop fighting everything internally, something remarkable happens. The body begins to work with you instead of against you, and that is what carried me quietly and steadily all the way to 100. If I could sit across from you now, not as someone who has all the answers, but as someone who has simply lived long enough to see what endures, I would not give you a long list of rules. I would not tell you to chase perfection. I would not tell you that health is something you must constantly control. I would tell you this, as clearly as I can. The one thing that carried me to 100 was learning how to stop adding unnecessary pressure to my own life. That is it. It sounds small, almost too simple, and that is exactly why it is overlooked. Because we are taught to believe that the answer must be complex, that it must come from expertise, from systems, from something outside of us. But what I learned slowly over decades is that the body is not only influenced by what you give it, it is deeply affected by what you stop forcing it to carry. Every day, in ways you may not even notice, you are either adding pressure or releasing it. In how you think, in how you react, in how tightly you hold on to things that have already passed, in how much you try to control what cannot be controlled. Doctors can guide you, they can treat you, they can help you when something goes wrong, and that is valuable, do not misunderstand me. But they cannot live inside your mind. They cannot feel the tension you carry in your thoughts. They cannot measure the weight of what you refuse to let go. And yet, those invisible things shape your health just as much, sometimes more, than anything that appears on a test result. If there is one thing I wish I had understood earlier, it is this. Your body does not need you to manage everything perfectly. It needs you to stop working against it, to stop creating constant internal resistance, to stop turning every moment into something that must be controlled, fixed, or anticipated. When you reduce that pressure, even slightly, you begin to notice changes. Your breathing softens, your body relaxes, your mind becomes clearer. And over time, those small changes accumulate into something much greater. Not dramatic transformation, but quiet stability. And stability is what carries you forward, year after year. I did not live to 100 because I was the most disciplined. I lived to 100 because I learned when not to force, when to step back, when to let things unfold without tightening against them. And that is something no one ever formally taught me. I had to see it, feel it, live it. So if you take anything from my life, let it be this. You do not need to fight your way to health. You do not need to control every detail to stay well. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to release what your body was never meant to carry in the first place. That is the one thing, and it has been with me every step of the way to 100.